John Alexander is the federal MP for Bennelong and a former professional tennis player. He doesn't believe the immigration minister should choose to deport Djokovic.
Seems no reason to do so. The judge has been abundantly clear in his finding and his comments around the finding, saying essentially what more could this man have done to meet the criteria that had been set down. And he not only ordered his release, but he also gave the decision with costs. So it's a pretty emphatic decision. But the process is that the minister does have the right to overrule that.
Get to walk into the country without one?
Well, he filled out all of the forms to meet the conditions of exemption, in that he had been tested positive to COVID on December the 16th. That's one of the criteria. He met it, and therefore the judge has ruled in his favour.
And so have you communicated your position to Alex Hawke, the minister?
No.
Why?
I felt no need. I'm free to do whatever I want, really. Invested in it came about as a result of a great Australian player, Jack Crawford, in 1933, winning the Australian, the French, and Wimbledon. And prior to playing in the US, Jack had won 12 straight events. And Alison Danzig wrote in the New York Times that the championships, national championships of the four countries that had won the Davis Cup to this point should comprise the Grand Slam, in view that if Jack were to win the US championship, that would be his 13th straight tournament, and 13 straight hands in bridge is a Grand Slam. And that was done. It was hastily convened and agreed that these four championships would forevermore be known as the Grand Slam. They're very, very significant events, and Australia has invested mightily in our Grand Slam event. We are the second most successful country in Davis Cup, so we have a very, very strong grip on it. But these are to prove that that's the thing that we treat.
Now, between the tracks, I'm Australian. Between
and
they are not expect this to
or our workers, more importantly, to stay home and furlough, and that's why we've been so adamant about getting these changes done, and the government's changes yesterday are very welcome.
Can you give us an idea of the proportion of the workforce that's being impacted?
It's a site by site, but as low as 20% absenteeism, as high as 90% absenteeism for our workers, and that's not just at meat processing facilities. That's also transportation. That's also at our wholesale areas. That's across pork as well as beef, sheep meat, goat, poultry. So it's just an unfortunate scenario that we've had to face. So it's through the whole supply chain from almost gate to plate. So again, these changes that we've worked on with the government, state and federal, alongside of people like the Australian Food and Grocery Council and the supermarkets, has allowed us to then get these changes in place and get meat starting to move again. Which parts of the country would you say are worst affected? Look, we've seen it and heard it on the eastern seaboard, but it hasn't just been located there. Obviously, we have also heard of smaller occurrences in South Australia and Tasmania. Obviously, WA is its own country at the moment, and therefore is managing it a little differently than everybody else. However, what we have also noticed has been that it's not just, as I said, in one spot. It is through the whole supply chain, and also impacting things like small goods manufacturing. And small goods industry in Australia is a $4 billion a year industry. So that closing down or grinding to a halt as well due to staff shortages has had an impact across the board. And that's why we've seen supermarkets putting rationing on meat products. That's why we've seen our butchers across Australia take up the challenge and actually be able to fill those gaps that supermarkets have had. But overall, what we've seen is that this change has come about really quickly from the federal and state government. This is industry and government working together finally. It's taken us 2 years. It's taken us many different starts, but we finally got there at the time that we desperately needed it, especially for farmers, but for everybody right through to obviously consumers.
Are shortages and purchase limits having any impact on prices at all?
Not that we've seen, and we would now hopefully start to see that those limitations on purchases at supermarkets be removed, fairly quickly. But we've just got to be getting people back to work. So that's the main thing. What's been great about this, Mandy, as opposed to every other issue that we've faced with COVID over the last 2 years, has finally been a level of trust from the health departments, federally and state-based, in the industry itself to be able to manage its own outcome. That's what we've been desperately trying to get, and we finally got it. So it's the employers and the employees working together to make sure that they understand their own obligations in regards to sick staff, but also the obligations of the employee, that they're coming to work and they're monitoring their own symptoms and they're working with their employer to do that. So that is a massive step forward and gives that independence and accountability to the employers and the employees to get this done. And so that's why we probably would see these, I guess, the impacts that we've seen for meat, not just prices but also supply, hopefully get knocked over pretty quickly.
How challenging is it for your workers to get hold of rapid antigen tests?
Very, very hard, but I think it's very hard for the whole community. And this is where we've wanted to desperately try to change the narrative and also change the system. For too long, Australia's biggest agribusiness, being meat processing, has had to compete with the community to get access to areas when we're an essential service. Meat is a non-discretionary spend, and we've seen that throughout the pandemic. We don't want to be competing as we have in the past, like for vaccinations or competing for testing spots or competing for other areas. We don't want to then be competing for rapid antigen tests. So we've heard from the CMO that there's 200 million rapid antigen tests on their way. We need to be able to get access to that as an essential service very effectively and very quickly. Now, we don't want to do that whilst competing with the community. So what we've really got to look at is now that we're able to manage this employer to employee, we've got to be working with our employees to make sure that they're getting access to rapid antigen tests in order to ensure that they're actually managing it from their part. And if they can't get access to it, we've got to be working with them to help them get it as well. So it's really going to be an employee and employer structure.
South Australia Health has allowed some asymptomatic COVID-positive staff to continue working at a Naracoorte abattoir following a cluster of 140 cases. The Meat Industry Employees Union says there are no masks, no social distancing being practiced, and that the decision isn't good enough. What do you make of this? Should COVID-positive staff be allowed to work?
Look, I don't know too much about that case. What I do know, though, unfortunately, is the union sort of picks and chooses the issues it wants to face when it's only got a single-digit membership of total workers in Australia for the meat industry. That being said, again, we have high-level PPE because we need high-level PPE because we're processing a perishable product and a food product in Australia. So we've led the world in a lot of circumstances around COVID-safe management plans. We've led the world in a lot of these areas, and in fact, the South Australian government has been using the Australian Meat Industry Council COVID-safe plans and our COVID guidelines with other industries as a guidepost for the last 18 months. So, look, I think that the company would not be going into any of these areas lightly. And I think that this is just the unfortunate scenario of the union picking and choosing something, embellishing a few facts and moving forward. So, look, I wouldn't put too much stock in that, to be honest, Mandy, because, again, as I said, we are huge users of PPE. And, in fact, we've had to be negotiating with certain governments around the country to try and pull back on the amount of PPE that people were using because, in effect, what was occurring was it was almost making it impossible to work because people were wearing so much PPE. So, look, it's I think that it's a bit of a storm in the teacup.
Meat Industry Council CEO Patrick Hutchinson there. Well, time for another check of sport with Daniel Garb. And Dan, we thought that we'd take a little break from Novak Djokovic this half hour, focusing on an Australian doing amazing things in the golf world.
Yeah, let's do that because Cameron Smith, Mandy, has achieved a feat that only 9 other Australian males have managed in the past, in history. And that is entering the top 10 of golf's world rankings. And he did that with a victory in the Tournament of Champions yesterday, which is a best of the best field. All the tournament winners from the year before qualify. And Cameron Smith emerged triumphant after a battle with world number 1, Jon Rahm. And in doing so shot the lowest ever score in PGA Tour history at 34 under the card. So it was an extraordinary day for the 28-year-old Queenslander who moved from 21 in the world to number 10 in the world and well and truly distanced himself from the likes of Mark Leishman and Adam Scott as Australia's premier male golfer, and the one that we can look at now to every single major as a serious chance of winning. He's a fantastic story. He is someone who is unique, and I think Australians are getting to know him more and more all the time, and the golfing world is becoming rather enamoured with the Queenslander.
So what is it that makes him so good and his character so endearing?
Well, from a golfing point of view, first and foremost, his short game is simply amazing. I mean, he is arguably the best short game player in the world. Jordan Spieth is one that can challenge him. I mean, they're all fantastic putters on the PGA Tour, but Cameron Smith at his best, and certainly in the weekend that's just passed, he looked in that fashion. He's hard to go past. I mean, his ability to drain long putts and get a putt close every time and a chip close is just remarkable how consistent he is. He's good off the tee as well and good with his irons, but that's not his strength. It's his short game. But then what makes him so endearing? I mean, he's a quintessential knockabout Australian bloke. He's still got the long rat's tail. He's got a little moustache. He looks different to everyone on the PGA Tour, and I think the fans are loving that. And he doesn't seem to be affected by the riches that he has amassed at all. I mean, he's probably worth around $30 million now in terms of prize money won over the last 5 years. And he was asked about the money he wins and what another big purse would mean to him. And he says, not a whole lot. Not much would change. I'm pretty good. Maybe I'd buy some new fishing equipment. That was a quote from him last year, which the golf world really lapped up and fell in love with. So he is remaining true to himself, which is just a Queenslander who likes a good time and just happens to be one of the best golfers in the world.
The Masters is the most prestigious tournament in golf. What are his chances there?
Very good, very good. I think Australians should get pretty excited about Cameron Smith's hopes at Augusta now. I mean, it's still in April, so there's still a while to go, a few months. But it is such a big event and something that means so much to Australian sports fans because we've only recently had a first-time winner there in Adam Scott back in 2013. Prior to that, it was a huge drought in Australian sport, punctuated by, of course, the torture that we all felt when Greg Norman missed out in...
Well, Daniel, we seem to have lost you there. Daniel Garb with our sport. He will hopefully return in the next half hour, gremlins permitting. You're listening to ABC News Radio. Turning now to finance, and the All Ords down 28 points, 7,737. The ASX 200 down 33 points, 7,413. Gold's at $1,800 US an ounce. The Aussie dollar now at 71.8 US cents, 52 British pence, 63 euro cents, 82 Japanese yen, and $1.06 New Zealand. To the weather now, Brisbane, possible morning shower and 29 degrees. You're on 26. Sydney, partly cloudy and 29. It's now 27. Canberra, showers, a possible storm and 26. You're on 23. In Melbourne, possible morning shower, then sunny and 29 degrees forecast. It's now 25. Hobart, partly cloudy for you with 20 degrees. You're on 17. Adelaide, very hot, humid and sunny, 39 your maximum. In Adelaide, it's now 32 degrees. Sunny in Perth and 37, 20 degrees now. And in Darwin, mostly sunny for your Tuesday, 35 degrees. In Darwin, it's now 30. Eastern Daylight Time, 11 o'clock. South Australia, 10:30. Queensland, 10 o'clock. The Northern Territory, 9:30. In the West, it's now 8 o'clock. News time.
Morning, Sarah Hall with ABC News. New South Wales has recorded 11 more deaths from COVID-19 as hospitalisations continue to rise. Here's Chantel Alcuri.
25,870 people tested positive to the virus, but these numbers only include PCR tests, not results from rapid antigen testing. COVID-19 hospitalisations have increased by 156 patients, bringing the total to 2,186. 170 of them are in intensive care compared to 159 yesterday. More than 71,000 tests were carried out in the latest reporting period. A self-reporting feature for rapid antigen tests is set to be rolled out within the Service New South Wales app.
Victoria's COVID hospital admissions have hit a new record as new infections threaten to overwhelm the state's ambulance system. The details from Leanne Wong.
There are now 861 Victorians in hospital with COVID, the highest number seen since the pandemic began. 117 patients are in intensive care, and of them, 27 are on ventilators. Overnight, Ambulance Victoria was forced to declare its second code red in less than a week after paramedics were overwhelmed by a spike in calls to 000. Ambulance Victoria Union Secretary Danny Hill says the strain on the state's ambulance system is likely to continue amid staff shortages and high demand.
I wouldn't be surprised if we see this happening almost every night shift over the next couple of weeks.
Victoria has recorded another 37,994 infections and 13 deaths.
The number of Tasmanians being treated in hospital for COVID has dropped to 7. There are 18 people in hospital who have COVID, but 11 are actually being treated for other medical reasons. The state has recorded 1,379 new cases today. Just over 1,000 of the new cases were diagnosed through rapid antigen tests. Australian government MP and former professional tennis player John Alexander is urging his colleagues to allow Novak Djokovic to remain in the country to compete in the Australian Open. It comes a day after the Federal Circuit Court overturned the tennis champion's visa cancellation. Immigration Minister Alex Hawke still has the power to cancel the world number one's visa, deporting him. Mr Alexander told ABC Radio Melbourne the judge's decision should be the end of the case.
It was a very clear decision by the court. I think the words the judge used was, what more could have this man done to meet the criteria? The judge was satisfied he met the criteria. To me and most people, I think that's pretty much the end of the case.
The Biden administration says Americans will be able to order free rapid COVID tests through a federal website later this month. It comes after the president faced criticism over the holiday season for a shortage of at-home tests. White House spokesperson Jen Psaki says they're still working closely with manufacturers to make them more accessible.
The president's plan to procure and distribute 500 million tests to all Americans is in and of itself providing a major stimulus for global production of these tests. Our objective here is to expand access to free public testing. We're already in the process of sending 50 million rapid antigen tests directly to federally qualified health centers.
US officials say they're working closely with Australia and other countries to step up their game in the Indo-Pacific region. White House Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell says he expects a strategic surprise in the region, a possible reference to China. The US, UK and Australia signed a historic security pact last year to counter China's influence in the contested South China Sea. The deal's being criticised by China as irresponsible, adding that the alliance risks damaging regional peace. An emergency warning remains in place for a bushfire threatening lives and homes in WA's southwest. The warning is in place for parts of Eagle Bay, Naturalist and Dunsborough in the city of Busselton. The Department of Fire and Emergency Services says people in the affected area must act immediately to survive. The blaze started near the intersection of Curtis Bay Beach in Dunsborough about 8 o'clock last night. And ex-tropical cyclone Tiffany has been downgraded to a tropical low. Bureau of Meteorology forecaster Shane Kennedy says the storm cell will soon cross the Queensland coast into the Gulf of Carpentaria.
So still expected to track fairly quickly west, so moving away from Queensland, but it'll be quite likely to have a fairly major impact on the Northern Territory when it makes impact later this week.
The Weather Bureau says it will likely regain cyclone status as it tracks towards the Gulf, towards the Northern Territory. I'm Sarah Hall and you're up to date with the latest from ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
I'm Andy Pressland. Coming up on the program.
I just wonder why Djokovic shouldn't be treated like the rest of Australian public.
Novak Djokovic plans to play in the Australian Open after a judge quashed the cancellation of his visa. Also on the program.
There will be more appointments becoming available every hour as more and more clinics open up their appointment systems.
The federal government urges patients to persevere with booking vaccine appointments for their 5 to 11-year-olds. Mostly sunny in Perth and Darwin, showers in Brisbane, Canberra and Melbourne, cloudy elsewhere. Tennis world number one Novak Djokovic says he wants to stay and compete at this year's Australian Open. It follows yesterday's court decision to overturn the cancellation of his visa. It came just a week after Djokovic revealed he had received a vaccination exemption from Australia. The news sparked a swift response from Melburnians last week, angry he might be receiving special treatment. Here's what people are saying today.
I'm a practising GP. He did not have a valid exemption as according to the Border Force rules. Now, I think the hearing yesterday was completely befuddled by that battery of lawyers who threw a million points of law at the judge. And I think it obscured the key issue, which was, does he have a valid exemption according to the rules?
I think it's a huge no from us in this country.
So do you think he should never have been granted an exemption in the first place?
Yeah, definitely. Look up our rules, and it's a no, so why do that? Why push that?
I just wonder why Djokovic shouldn't be treated like the rest of Australian public and be told he has to have the first shot of the vaccine to stay in the country, otherwise he can go back to his own country. That gives him a choice. He can't argue that we haven't given him a choice, and he would have been put in the same position as most other Australians were, where they had to make the choice, and they've made the right choice.
That's a sample of the callers into ABC Radio Melbourne speaking with Ali Moore. Meantime, Shadow Home Affairs Minister Christina Keneally won't say if tennis star Novak Djokovic's visa should be cancelled. The Immigration Minister Alex Hawke is weighing up whether or not to intervene and cancel his visa after the Federal Circuit Court successfully overturned the earlier decision to do so. Senator Keneally says there will be serious consequences no matter what the minister does. So for more on the political fallout of the Djokovic court decision, we're joined by political journalist Malcolm Farr. Malcolm, after Novak Djokovic arrived in Australia last week, the Prime Minister said the rules are the rules. Is this likely to come back and haunt him?
Oh, I think so, because there is some indication, a very strong suggestion, let's say, that the Australian government didn't know what the rules were. Djokovic got to Australian territory. He landed in Melbourne with a visa. And it hasn't been explained how he got that, given he couldn't fulfil the obligations with regard to vaccination, and this had been obvious for some time. Also, he had tested positive back in December 16, and this would have been noted, and why he was allowed to touch our soil is a mystery. So far, this mystery has involved 4 government ministers, the Immigration Minister Alex Hawke at the moment, the Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews, Foreign Minister to a degree Marise Payne, and of course the Prime Minister. It's a real kerfuffle, and as the excerpts you played indicate, there is a feeling among voters that this bloke shouldn't have turned up and should be sent packing, but that basic question, how did he get here in the first place, cannot be answered without the government looking silly.
So what are the options now for the Immigration Minister, Alex Hawke?
Well, the big one, the big stick, is to remove Djokovic's visa and definitely send him packing. It's sort of a bit late for that, isn't it? The other option for the government as a whole is to let this ride, let him play, and try and reduce the embarrassment already being felt by the government and by Australia, and somehow quarantine him on a tennis court. I don't know how they would do that, but anything stronger than that, any action by the Immigration Minister or Home Affairs or Border Force will simply multiply the essence of the embarrassment already being felt.
So has the government effectively been wedged by what's transpired?
It started with the Prime Minister being very rough and tough, and I think, as you pointed out, saying that rules are the rules and no one is exempt. But it seemed that the Prime Minister didn't know what the rules were either, and Mr. Djokovic mightn't have been fully apprised of them. So they were wandering around in the dark, bumping into each other until this court case raised the judge made the suggestion that the tennis player had done all that could be expected of him, that he'd followed those rules, and that the government was suddenly deciding that its rules weren't good enough. And you've got to remember that the Prime Minister in particular has made this a border security issue. He did so in a statement last week. He said, we're worse the effect, we're constantly, we'll continue to be vigilant. So he liked the idea that perhaps the federal government was being seen as tough, protecting the edges of Australia from interlopers, but it doesn't look as vigilant and as effective as he might have wanted.
Could the Djokovic court decision set a precedent for other people who've been rejected at the border due to COVID requirements?
Well, I think the precedent it sets is don't bother coming to Australia to play elite sport, because they'll muck you around and want to know your medical history and make very public your views on certain health issues that you mightn't ordinarily promulgated. That's one consequence. But if the government did allow him to continue to play, then certainly that would be seen as an escape clause for other athletes in other pursuits, including tennis players. But I think the Djokovic case will be seen as a special and a singular one.
Former tennis player Bennelong MP John Alexander says Australia's ability to host a Grand Slam might be impacted if Djokovic is deported away from the sporting arena. Internationally, could there be blowback for the Morrison government?
Well, there's one reading of the law is if he were punted from Australia, then he wouldn't be able to come back for 3 years. So that's the possibility then is that for 3 years of the Australian Open, the world number one wouldn't be able to turn up. So that devalues the Australian Open considerably. Plus, the message, as we sort of touched on just a moment ago, the message to other elite athletes is save yourself a lot of pain and don't come here.
Back home, of course, the government has always played tough on border policy. Arguably, it's been popular at the ballot box at various times in the last couple of decades. What's at stake in this election year?
There are a couple of things happening that aren't very pleasant for the Prime Minister at the moment. One, of course, is the tennis tumult. The other one is the availability of various COVID measures, everything from vaccinations for youngsters to provision of testing equipment, and not just the at-home ones, but there are people still queuing up to have the big tests. Now, juggling both those has put a strain on the Prime Minister's pretense to be in charge of things. And he probably, if he was given an option, would prefer to be the tough guy on border protection than the loser on COVID. But it's very hard for him to avoid either with lots of people locking themselves away, lots of their shelves in supermarkets, and no real assurance that the provision of the testing equipment or the testing appointments or the vaccines, that supply of these is going to improve substantially over the next couple of weeks.
What do they say, Malcolm? Buckle in. It's going to be a rough ride. I think this election year is going to be very interesting for all of us. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure, Mandy.
Political journalist Malcolm Farr there. This is ABC News Radio, Eastern Daylight Time, 11:15. In South Australia, it's 11:45. Queensland, 10:15. The Northern Territory, 10:45. In Western Australia, it's 8:15. Time for a check of our headlines. Making news today.
We were maybe caught a little off guard, but we didn't see them as being a solution. Governments weren't recognising them.
The head of one of Australia's largest privately owned freight companies says they desperately need rapid antigen tests to help tackle supply chain shortages. Queensland's Chief Health Officer says it's inevitable children will get COVID-19 when they return to school. The state has delayed the start of the school year by 2 weeks. And 150 firefighters are continuing to battle a bushfire that's threatening lives and homes in Western Australia's southwest. An emergency warning is in place for people in parts of Eagle Bay, Naturalist and Dunsborough in the city of Busselton. Parents, staff and students are eagerly awaiting a meeting of National Cabinet later this week, hoping for some clarity about the start of the new school year. Queensland is already delaying a return for 2 weeks amid concern about a peak in case numbers at the end of the month. South Australia could do the same with issues in the rollout of vaccinations for primary-aged children just a day after the program started. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Michael Kidd, has encouraged parents to persevere with booking appointments for their 5 to 11-year-olds to get vaccinated.
Yesterday, the first day of the rollout of the vaccination program for the 5 to 11-year-olds, we had over 35,000 5 to 11-year-olds who were vaccinated, in fact 35,077, so huge thanks to everybody who turned up to get vaccinated yesterday. We currently have over 6,000 places in Australia where people can have their children vaccinated against COVID-19. That will increase to 8,000 sites over the coming few days, and that includes general practices, pharmacies, the state and territory hubs, and also the Aboriginal medical services. Now, I do acknowledge as a GP that many parents would like to have their children vaccinated by their own GP or by the nurse at the general practice where their children are used to receiving their childhood vaccines. And we're working very closely with all the general practices which are involved in the rollout to make sure that general practices have the stock that they need. Please, if you do go online and you're having difficulty making an appointment, you can, of course, make appointments at local pharmacies as well. And there will be more appointments becoming available every hour as more and more clinics open up their appointment systems.
Can I just talk about the waste of time, though? Parental time, specifically, trying to get this done. I mean, I'm speaking as a parent. I have spent hours trying to get my kids into state vaccination hubs, calling around GPs, calling around pharmacies. That's here in Victoria. That's not the case for everyone. How are you going to change the distribution patterns away from state hubs to GPs, because GPs clearly need more? Is that going to be a change that you're going to be making this week?
So, Madeline, firstly, we have enough of the paediatric Pfizer vaccine for every 5 to 11-year-old to receive their first dose by the end of this month. So there is no need to panic about not being able to get an appointment over the next few days. There will be appointments available over the next couple of weeks before children are starting to go back to school in Australia. The hubs are playing a very important role in our vaccine rollout, as are our general practices and pharmacies and other centres as well. So it's important that we have this distribution network of clinics available for people to be able to get their vaccines in a timely manner. So you're not going to change
the distribution, though, is my question.
Well, that's probably a question for Lieutenant General Frewen, who, of course, is leading the logistics for the vaccine rollout in Australia.
OK. Can I just talk to you about schools? Now, Queensland is putting back schools by 2 weeks up until year 10. Is there an argument for doing that elsewhere?
So, as you know, the National Cabinet is meeting on Thursday of this week, and the return to school for the children of Australia is the top item on the agenda for the National Cabinet meeting. So I don't want to preempt the decisions which are going to be made at that meeting, but this is a top priority, getting the children of Australia back to school. And of course, the vaccination program for the 5 to 11-year-olds and the continuing vaccination program for those aged 12 and above is a very important part of ensuring that that happens.
Just on the issue of key workers, now the key government advisory panel which you're on has approved new isolation rules for key workers. Can you explain what those are?
Yes, so yesterday we publicly released the guidance for workers in the food and grocery distribution industry. And I want to make very clear that if a person working in that industry is diagnosed with COVID-19, either through a PCR test or a rapid antigen test, that person needs to isolate at home. And the same applies to their close contacts, to their household contacts. What has happened in the new guidance is that there is a distinction between those who are at high risk of having contracted COVID-19 and those who are deemed to be at low risk of having contracted COVID-19. And those who are deemed to be at low risk will still be required to be assessed for symptoms each day. They'll be required to have testing to make sure that they don't become positive for COVID-19, but they will also be allowed to continue to work in those non-public facing roles in food and grocery distribution. What is important, though, is that every business, every industry is required to have their own COVID-safe plan to make sure that they are doing all that they can to maximise the safety of their workforce and of anyone else who comes into contact with those workers.
That's the Chief Medical Officer, Michael Kidd, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Michael Kidd, speaking there with Madeline Morris. Overseas now, Kazakhstan's president says last week's unrest was caused by an attempted coup. The demonstrations began after a near doubling of prices for petrol and quickly spread across the country. Kazakhstan officials say about 8,000 people have been detained by police, and the authorities have declared a day of mourning for victims. 164 people, including 3 children, were killed in the unrest. Alexander Cooley is a professor of political science at Barnard College in New York and a specialist on Central Asia. So what does he think of the president's framing of the situation as a thwarted coup attempt?
I think this is part of a growing attempt of Central Asian leaders trying to justify their own crackdown in terms of external interferences and also alleged coup d'etat attempts. There's no doubt that a couple of things went on in Kazakhstan. One is a series of protests that began in the West that culminated in demonstrations in Almaty. But at the same time, there was an inter-elite struggle between Tokayev and some set of factions and political allies of President Nazarbayev. And so he is emphasizing the coup part. But of course, the demonstrations themselves had multiple types of causes.
If this is what happened, it happened simultaneously. Is that a coincidence or was it planned? Do you have any sense?
Our best information appears to be that once the demonstrations started, that there were indeed provocateurs that spurred on violence and also appeared to cause disruptions. At the same time, I think it's important to understand that the appeal to Russia itself was less to quell and bring stability in the demonstrations and more to signal to the Kazakh security services that Tokayev is the one in charge, maintain their loyalty, and that the Kremlin will recognize this government and no other. So the two are quite intertwined.
So if we're looking at this as a power struggle, is it one that President Tokayev has won?
We don't know yet. Prior to this, he was viewed as part of Nazarbayev's inner circle. And so for him to project that he is an outsider to Nazarbayev and gain that kind of political legitimacy is going to be difficult. The other problem that he faces is Nazarbayev always emphasized preserving the sovereignty of Kazakhstan. Now, Tokayev is going to be associated with compromising that sovereignty to allow for Russian CSTO peacekeepers to come in. The long-term impact on Tokayev's legitimacy remains very much an open question, especially because he has been so uncompromising in his rhetoric.
That's Alexander Cooley there, a professor of political science at Barnard College in New York, speaking with the BBC's James Kumarasamy. Well, time now on ABC News Radio for another check of sport, and Daniel Garb's back with us. And the Novak Djokovic situation still unresolved despite his visa being reinstated.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a judge ruled yesterday that it was unreasonable to cancel the world number one tennis player's visa, and so the anti-vaxxer returned to training in Melbourne last night, but he can still be booted out of the country by the Australian government. That is the final bit of word that the world and certainly the Australian public is waiting on if Immigration Minister Alex Hawke decides to use what is at his disposal, and that is personal discretion, to deport Novak Djokovic from the country because he doesn't satisfy the reasons for a medical exemption to compete in the Australian Open. It was an amazing 12 hours yesterday after he was released from immigration detention and allowed to have his visa reinstated and then prepare for the Australian Open with his team, which he did last night. And he released a statement and a photo of him on Melbourne Park getting ready for the Australian Open. His supporters clashed with police. And then his family held a press conference in Serbia with all of their trophies out on display and said this is the biggest title of all. But there are still people who want Alex Hawke, the immigration minister, to use his personal discretion and remove Novak Djokovic from the country. Let's hear from Liberal MP Julian Simmons.
Certainly I would be in favour of the visa being cancelled as a member of the Australian Parliament, because I think that would show Australians that there is one rule for everybody, and there isn't hypocrisy depending on whether you're a famous celebrity or sportsman.
And it looks like an Australian tennis name may also be out of the Open.
This would be disappointing. Nick Kyrgios, who is, still our biggest name on the men's side of the draw. Alex de Minaur might be our biggest chance come the Australian Open. But Nick Kyrgios, as we know, is box office. And if he drew Novak Djokovic on the men's side of the draw, that would be something to behold, because there is a history of animosity between the two, to say the least. But he contracted COVID-19 and pulled out of his clash with Italian Fabio Fognini at the Sydney Tennis Classic yesterday, just hours before he was set to take to the court. He also withdrew from the Melbourne Somerset last week, Nick Kyrgios. So even if he is fit to play in the Australian Open, it has been a hugely disruptive build-up to it for him, and hopes are really low of him having a long run in Australia's Grand Slam. He's now ranked 114 in the world, 26 years of age. It's touch and go now to see if he can make the Australian Open. It'll be a day or two before he can deliver a negative test, in the lead up to the tournament starting. So we wait and see if Nick Kyrgios takes his place at Melbourne Park.
The Perth Scorchers may have to watch their back with a serious title contender in cricket's Big Bash.
The Sydney Thunder are an impressive side at the moment, and they smashed the Hobart Hurricanes last night. The Hurricanes made 139 from their 20 overs. The Thunder reached that total in 17.2 overs. Alex Hales, superb at the top of the order, as he often is, 80 not out of 56 balls. Gurinder Sandhu took 2 for 32 for the Thunder. He's become a weapon with the ball for them. And now they've jumped up and they are challenging the Perth Scorchers in a big way, who have been the trendsetters and the pace setters all season long. The Thunder just 3 points behind them now on the table and on a very good run. They seem to have cruised through this disruptive period of, COVID cases within squads that have decimated some teams, and they're tracking pretty well ahead of the finals. The Melbourne Stars won last night as well. They beat the Adelaide Strikers. That's despite having 13 positive cases in their team recently. A number of their players came back and they were able to beat the Strikers with 5 balls to spare last night and get off the bottom of the Big Bash table.
Thank you very much, Dan. Dan Garb there with all of our sport. He'll be back in the next half hour of our program. Turning to finance, and the All Ords down 44 points, 7,720. The ASX 200 down 48 points, 7,398. West Texas crude's at $78 US a barrel. Gold $1,804 US an ounce. The Australian dollar 71.7 US cents, 52 British pence, 63 euro cents, 82 Japanese yen, and $1.06 New Zealand. To the weather now. Possible shower in Brisbane and 29 degrees. You're on 26. Sydney partly cloudy, heading for 29 degrees also. 27 currently. Canberra showers, a possible storm with 26 your maximum. You're on 23. Melbourne possible shower, then sunny and 29. Currently 25. Hobart partly cloudy and 20 degrees. You're on 17. Adelaide very hot, humid and sunny. 39 your top. Now 32. Sunny in Perth, 37 predicted, and it's 20 degrees. And in Darwin, mostly sunny, 35 your predicted high, now 30 degrees. Eastern Daylight Time is 11:30. In South Australia, it's 11 o'clock. Queensland, 10:30. The Northern Territory, it's 10 o'clock. In the West, it's 8:30. Time for the news.
Sarah Hall with ABC News. Federal Labor isn't giving a position on whether or not Novak Djokovic's visa should be cancelled again. Immigration Minister Alex Hawke is currently considering whether to deport the tennis star after Djokovic successfully overturned an earlier cancellation of his visa. Djokovic is unvaccinated but argues he arrived in Australia with a medical exemption on the grounds he had recovered from COVID-19. Opposition leader Anthony Albanese says it's a matter for the minister, but the whole process has been handled poorly.
Now we have a crisis all of the government's own making. This government should have got it right in the first place.
A leading emergency department doctor says people continue to struggle to access healthcare as Victoria's health system strains amid rising COVID hospital admissions. The head of emergency at Melbourne's Alfred Hospital says a majority of those presenting to hospital with COVID are unvaccinated. Dr Carl Luckhoff has told ABC Radio Melbourne there will be a number of challenges over the next few weeks.
I'm certainly nervous, and I think that we should have a healthy level of nervousness about the next few weeks. We're blessed that we are in a system where we have the ability to plan for any worst case scenario. In reciprocation, we also ask for the community to support us.
The peak body representing table grape growers has raised concerns the growing number of COVID cases across the Sunraysia region will cause problems during harvest. Mildura in Victoria's northwest recorded 154 new cases of the virus yesterday, taking its total to 680. Australian Table Grape Association Chair Jeremy Boyd says he's worried about what the virus could mean for farm workers living in close quarters.
Obviously, accommodations in fairly short supply during our peak harvest season in Sunraysia and Robin Vale, and it's a concern. But as I say, we're just trying to do everything we can to avoid that situation.
Another 11 people have died from COVID-19 in New South Wales, with the state recording 25,870 new cases via PCR testing. COVID hospitalisations have risen to 2,186, with 170 of them in intensive care. More than 71,000 tests were carried out in the latest reporting period. An out-of-control bushfire is continuing to threaten lives and homes in WA's southwest. An emergency warning has been issued for parts of Eagle Bay, Naturalist and Dunsborough in the city of Busselton. The blaze started near the intersection of Curtis Bay Beach in Dunsborough about 8 o'clock last night. Department of Fire and Emergency Services Incident Controller Blake Moore told Nine Radio the fire is still uncontained.
Dunsborough's quite well protected due to some very proactive prescribed burning programs over the last couple of years. Crews are working very hard in the Eagle Bay area to protect that settlement and then looking forward beyond that.
A man and woman have been charged with drug trafficking after allegedly trying to bring $750,000 worth of methamphetamine into Tasmania. The Turners Beach man and Wesley Vale woman were arrested at Launceston Airport on Sunday. The 43-year-old woman was bailed to reappear at court, while the 31-year-old man was remanded to reappear in court via video link this afternoon. Police say further arrests are expected to be made. Farmers say the buyback of land in northern New South Wales from a Chinese coal giant is proof the economics of agriculture trump mining. The state government has paid Shenhua $100 million to abandon its plans for an open-cut mine on the Liverpool Plains. National Farmers Federation President Fiona Simpson says locals have campaigned long and hard to block the project.
12 of our local farming families have been able to buy land that complements their own holdings, that secures the future of their farms for future generations, and it's just a really exciting and satisfying almost end to this decade-long battle that we've had.
And the town of Tenterfield in regional New South Wales has unveiled its new Young Woman of the Year Awards, which replace its annual Showgirls competition. The awards will focus on communication skills, volunteer responsibilities and special tasks involved with the local agricultural show. Organiser 2018 winner Keely Mooney says the competition needed to move with the times.
We have tried to go away from getting the young females to wear skirts and heels, as it is an agricultural show where it also helps with them to bring out the best in them to see for job opportunities and new interests as well for the young women.
ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
I'm Mandy Pressland. Thanks for your company. Coming up in the program.
I wouldn't be surprised if we see this happening almost every shift.
Code Red, Victoria's ambulance union says 135 people were waiting for ambulances early this morning. Also on the program.
These are really important projects and they're all in the humanities, and I think that's a very telling and important aspect.
Questions over the government's funding decisions for academic research. Mostly sunny in Perth and Darwin, showers in Brisbane, Canberra and Melbourne, cloudy elsewhere. Ambulance Victoria briefly declared a code red early this morning following a massive spike in calls for assistance. It comes as the state recorded 37,994 new COVID-19 cases and 13 more deaths in the latest reporting period. For more, we're joined by our reporter Leanne Wong in Melbourne. Leanne, can you run us through the latest COVID numbers, please?
Hi, Mandy. Well, as you mentioned, the state recorded another 37,994 new COVID infections. So that's a slight decrease on the 34,000 that we saw yesterday. And of today's numbers, they've come off the back of PCR and rapid antigen testing. It's about a 50-50 split. And that's been a trend that we've seen over the past few days ever since Victoria introduced that mandatory reporting system last week for all rapid antigen tests. Now, the state's also sadly seen another 13 more Victorians die with COVID, and that takes the total death toll during this entire outbreak to 1,593. But the main concern right now is just the increasing number of hospitalisations that we've seen, and that's really what has authorities quite concerned. So right now, there are 861 Victorians in hospital with COVID. That's the highest number we've seen throughout the entire pandemic, even during the peak of our Delta wave. So there's currently 117 people in ICU, and there are 27 people on ventilators. And we've heard that just having this number of admissions is really putting our hospital system under strain. We've heard from the Alfred today, so that's one of our major hospitals here in Melbourne, and they're saying that there's still the vast number of admissions that they're receiving have been unvaccinated Victorians. And it's really this rise in hospitalisations that we also saw yesterday. The Health Minister, Martin Foley, introduced new restrictions for Victoria, which are set to come into place from tomorrow night, and that's such things as the booster mandate for essential workers, as well as closing indoor dance floors simply because of this number of people who are in hospital.
So given the rising demand on ambulances and paramedics in Melbourne, what's the union had to say?
Yeah, so just for a bit of context, when Ambulance Victoria declares code red, it's usually a sort of disaster protocol that's normally reserved for things like bushfires and thunderstorm asthma. So for that reason, it's actually quite rare for them to declare code red. So they normally only make that declaration several times a year, and the fact that we've had 2 code reds now in less than a week, where the Ambulance Victoria Union says it's quite concerned. They said that overnight there are about 135 Victorians who were waiting on the ambulance at that point, and there were no ambulances available, and of them 25 were code 1. So that's the highest priority. These are people who really urgently need to get to hospital, and this code red lasted for about 3.5 hours last night. So that was just after midnight when there were just no ambulances available, and the paramedics were receiving a deluge of 000 calls. Ambulance Victoria Union has called this a perfect storm and basically of staff shortages and demand, because as we know, a number of paramedics are also furloughed due to just being in close contacts. Let's take a listen to what Union Secretary Danny Hill had to say today. He had quite a dire warning for Victorians.
I wouldn't be surprised if we see this happening almost every shift, almost every night shift over the next couple of weeks until we get through this surge. And I don't think the public should be surprised by that. They need to be aware that there is massive pressure on the system, massive delays in every part of the system. And if they dial 000, there is a chance that they may not get an ambulance on time, which is why it's so important that only people who desperately need an ambulance for a life-threatening condition are the ones who call. If it's just if it's a trivial complaint, if you're just feeling a bit unwell, a bit fluey with COVID, that's not what you call 000 for. You call 000 because you think you're in serious life threat, you're in a genuine emergency.
Danny Hill there from the Ambulance Union in Victoria. And Leanne, in the last half hour, Premier Daniel Andrews has spoken. He's back on deck after the Christmas break. What's he had to say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is the first press conference for the Premier Daniel Andrews since his holiday. So his major announcement today was saying that in the coming weeks, Victoria will be rolling out 30 pop-up vaccination clinics at primary schools across the state. So these pop-ups will be open to all Victorian children aged 5 to 11, not just those attending those schools. And that's really in order just to speed up that rollout. And these will be particularly located in high-risk areas, so local government areas in Victoria where we've traditionally seen a high number of COVID infections. So that's generally in the outer suburbs, so places like Brimbank, Casey, Hume and Darebin, and those bookings should be available soon. It's really now quite a large priority for the Victorian government to get these primary school children vaccinated, particularly as they've been pretty clear over the past few days that unlike Queensland, Victoria will not be delaying the return to school. So in the coming weeks, Victorian primary school children, of which there are about 1 million, they'll be returning back to school soon.
You would all remember that last year we worked very closely, over and above what we'd signed up to do, but we worked very closely with our community pharmacists who've done and are doing an amazing job, our GPs who similarly have and continue to do an amazing job. But it's a very different business model. They're not designed and they're not in business to run large vax hubs. So a grants program, we did this last year, we're doing it again this year, and I'm pleased today to be able to announce another $4 million of grants to GPs and community pharmacists to go into schools after hours, so a familiar environment, a well-known environment, to get our kids vaccinated. That begins very soon. Naomi can speak to the details of that. So that's just a continuation, a trusted, local, well-known environment using trusted and local, well-known, well-respected healthcare professionals, GPs and community pharmacists. They won't do that without support. It just won't happen. It wouldn't be efficient. They would lose money if they were to do that. So these grants help to take that care even more locally than would otherwise be the case. Beyond grants, we're also announcing today some 30 pop-up clinics that will pop up, as the name indicates, in schools, starting very soon.
That's Victoria's Premier Daniel Andrews. Leanne Wong, thank you very much for the update from Melbourne.
Thanks, Mandy.
That's our reporter Leanne Wong there in Melbourne. Leading Australian academics have criticised the federal government for what they're calling political and short-sighted research funding decisions amid accusations of interference in awarding grants. The projects, including research on climate activism and China, were rejected by the acting Education Minister Stuart Robert on Christmas Eve. The decision has angered many in the research community and has been condemned by hundreds of writers, academics and intellectuals in 2 open letters. Toby Walsh is a Laureate Fellow and Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of New South Wales. Thank you very much for your time. Can you explain what's happened here?
Yes, on Christmas Eve, the Minister was advised of nearly 600 grants that were recommended for funding. It's a very selective, rigorous, independent, peer-reviewed process, and he accepted only 593 of them, and 6 of them he rejected. This is something that rarely happens and something that is mix of political interference. Decision-making, ministers should use their discretion to make decisions on grants. Very rarely, whether it be for car parks sporting clubs, or in this case, research grants, we should be very sceptical.
You won one of these grants last year. What does the process involve, and who recommends which projects should be awarded funding?
So, like in many other countries, like in the UK, like in the US, there's a rigorous independent process where the grants are sent out to review by experts around the world. They're then assessed, including a test for national importance, and then recommendations are given to the minister, who normally, except in very rare circumstances, accepts all of those recommendations.
The Open Letter voices concerns about the way in which applications for the 2022 round of Discovery Projects grant funding has been handled. What are you and your colleagues most worried about?
Well, we're most worried about the minister using his discretion to decide what is or isn't worth funding, but equally also that the process seems to be becoming highly politicised. The decisions were only announced a month after they normally were, on Christmas Eve. It was as though perhaps they hoped that the news would not get a lot of attention, and just a few days before the grants were supposed to begin, and so lots of people's livelihood depends upon this notification, and it was a rather cruel, heartless decision to tell people on Christmas Eve whether they were going to have a job on.
But then denied funding. The Acting Education Minister Stuart for response. 110
and the aid is some local
other
and
his order
coastal list and control.
They don't way numbers stop violence aspect
on the focus food production strategy there are those secret
well not
risk is what with your concern every with safe maintain between GA
patients and
if bugs food years not
cancel to
the immigrants and
sell the lungs and well back now or many parts another one, and which is why
Ravi Gupta but science to fight the COVID
and a high amount of biotech HTLV more tractable immune immunologist and
as a form specialized M of this and instead of reaction
code so
see this get some of the
barrier
that's
not in New Melbourne visa camp British says it
Bay Area
Australians are cloudy and essential Simon the agriculture
left last week for us customers
allow a board and
contact test or portal test or portal medical
area sort of
throughout the moment so
underway stop see don't he's in dollar color one
so it's the whatever they challenge any scrum for farmers and regard ensure that lands are flooded.
That's fitted with to drive from Beans and the 100 hospitals cases in research at this songs and ignition underway. Cheryl
have to be bluff. Original
Dental
in the ground by up and takes all
you'll be
that I have for everything it is and of which is going also be the
how
general the music and the you from he's hard well and good about stands in terms of price a lot is remaining now
you can resolve
federal to his heat of
persons more coverage from the globe
radio
enjoy well to get
that's happening
those 5
children city so
what buyers
their shell make the in the world shouldn't really let their
thank you for speaking
mess like that also get it met by taking
sort of the